White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage have all become synonymous with the wielding of magic in Final Fantasy games. Each of them has their own unique strengths and weaknesses, and after their inclusion within the original game, they have been used on a consistent basis by developers as the franchise has built out. But despite their prominence and near persistent inclusion, they haven't always been the strongest options available to players, and from time to time, more powerful variants have been offered to help players overcome obstacles of increasing difficulty. In the original game, it saw the white, black, and red mages replaced by wizards of the same colour, and as the job system was enhanced over time, wizards were replaced with more unique jobs, with one of the more intriguing being the sage. Much like red mages, sages were able to use black and white magic in equal measure, but the standard restrictions often applied to the knowledge red mages could acquire were removed. To compensate, they were granted almost no prowess with physical weapons, had low HP, and diminished speed attributes. Nonetheless, sages were formidable specialists, and after their inclusion in Final Fantasy III, they have been used numerous times over the past 30 years, and will now be the focal point of the latest expansion to Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker. Throughout this video, we are going to take you on an expansive journey as we explore how every single appearance of the Sage has tied together to create one of the most powerful ultimate jobs in the history of the franchise.
Oh, please, avenge Anna.
Tella, no!
Final Fantasy III was when the Sage job became accessible to the player, but they were first introduced in the original Final Fantasy all the way back in 1987. One of the most famous figures in the world was known as Lucan, an important figure from Cornelia who prophesied that in the time of darkness, 4 warriors of light would appear to restore the light to the crystals and balance to the elements of the world. Upon venturing to Crescent Lake, the player would then meet the legendary Lucan, a man who was quite advanced in age and appeared as the 12th sage in the Circle of Sages, or the 12 Sages as they were known in the Japanese version of the game. The sages had incredible mystical powers, able to even see glimpses of the future, and although it was a small, fleeting appearance, it was a defining one, and this became clear when Final Fantasy III released on the Famicom a few years later. In its original format, Final Fantasy III featured 22 separate jobs. Many could be obtained from the various crystals that were encountered as the story progressed, and the Devout, Magus, and Summoner, which served as enhanced versions of the White Mage, Black Mage, and Evoker, could be obtained from the Earth Crystal. But there were 2 other jobs that could be obtained from Eureka, Ninja, and Sage. Unlike the other spruced up mage jobs, the Sage could use white and black magic from levels 1 to 8, as well as all available summon magic, and when combined with high stat growth in intelligence and mind, it made them a veritable powerhouse when it came to magical utility. In short, the Sage was the ultimate mage job. The only downside was that unlike red mages, who could also use black and white magic, sages were not proficient with weapons, only able to use staves and rods, and they were given low strength to compound this weakness. To further balance out their immense power, sages were also given less MP slots than their equivalent upgraded jobs that specialised in a particular field of magic, and this meant their continued use throughout long sections of play could represent something of a risk. Final Fantasy IV reintroduced the notion of a named cast of characters, but unlike Final Fantasy II, they were each given a specific focus, and in the role of the Sage was Tella, a crotchety old man. It was not uncommon for those who lived in Dissidia to be able to learn either black or white magic, but from a young age, Tella had shown significant talent with the arcane, something that allowed him to master both schools of magic with relative ease. Due to the amount of knowledge that Tella accrued, his contemporaries granted him the status of Sage. Many Dissidians also aspired to replicate his feats through continued study, and this positioned Tella as holding an ultimate job. From a gameplay perspective, Tella exhibited numerous traits that had been identified in Final Fantasy III. He had access to a wide range of white and black magic, even possessing the knowledge required to cast a legendary meteor spell. However, he didn't have access to every spell, with a handful like Holy and Flare beyond the bounds of his knowledge. There was also a regression, as although summon spells were present, due to a narrative decision, they were associated exclusively with the summoner race. Perhaps owing to his old age, Teller was also quite frail, able to only use staves and rods in combat, and he had very low strength and stamina. But when it came to magic, intellect and spirit were equal, something that allowed every spell in Teller's arsenal to be used with a high degree of proficiency. Another interesting note was that Teller had an equivalent to the Sage's reduced spell slots in Final Fantasy III, as no matter how much the player increased his level, his modest MP pool would never increase. This made sure players had to be smart with how they used Teller, as the tendency would be to splurge MP on high impact spells, something that would render him useless for prolonged encounters. Alongside Teller, Final Fantasy IV also featured another unofficial sage, Fusaya, whose official job was Lunarian. Also appearing as an elderly gentleman, Fusaya exhibited almost identical traits, access to every black and white magic spell in the game, and high intellect and spirit, coupled with low strength and stamina, and a reduced MP pool that served to temper his potential. The only major difference was that in addition to being able to use staves and rods, Fusaya could also use a bow. Final Fantasy V featured an expansive job system that saw significant steps taken to build upon what was established in Final Fantasy III, but even though there was an increase in the volume of jobs available to the player, there was no room for the ultimate mage, as players were now encouraged to mix and match to create their own hybrid mage classes. That's not to say the sage role was completely absent though, as it was associated with an NPC called Guido. Appearing as a venerable green turtle, Guido served as not only a fountain of knowledge, but also a formidable ally, even able to lock horns with Exdeath and survive. Guido was also immortalized in the Final Fantasy I re-releases, as Gil, the name associated to Guido for the Final Fantasy Anthology translation of Final Fantasy V, was available as a default name for red mages. Now, Final Fantasy VI featured many venerable characters, but none of them were granted the status of sage, and outside of the Chocobo Sage, who was known as the Chocobo Hermit in the Japanese version, it was much the same in Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VIII, however, did feature a playable character who exhibited some loose traits often associated with sages, and that character was Adia Kramer. Appearing as an antagonist throughout much of the first half of the game, Adia was a formidable foe due to her mastery of magic, and it was through these encounters that we could glean some loose traits that classified her as a sage. During the first encounter, which took place at the Delling City Carnival, Adia used a variety of high-tier elemental spells, but she could also use Dispel, a mid to high-tier spell often found within the arsenal of a white mage. The second encounter was similar, in that Adia gained access to even stronger black magic spells like Death and Maelstrom, but she could also use Reflect, which was a gain from the school of white magic. In the more literal sense, Adia was also much older and wiser than the rest of the playable cast, fulfilling that particular trait, and after joining the party, Adia had stats that were in line as she had high magic and spirit with low vitality. But as a slight deviation, Adia also had quite high strength and could deal very powerful physical attacks even if they weren't actually physical in their nature. After the appearance of Adia, the Sage was withdrawn from mainstream use. There was no strong association in either Final Fantasy IX or X outside of tenuous links, and even though there were numerous jobs available in Final Fantasy XI, the Sage was not accessible to the player. But Sages did appear, as there were a few beastmen that adorned the job, and they included Sage Lord Mulal Jar, who was part of an R2-Garn mission, as well as being a mega-boss in a level 3 Besieged, and the Velk Sage, a random mob. It wouldn't be until Final Fantasy Tactics Advance that the Sage would resurface for the player to use in an active capacity. It appeared as an advanced job that was exclusive to the Numu race, and it could be accessed by upgrading Beastmaster to level 2 and White Mage to level 3. This was an interesting distinction, as there was no direct association with Black Mage in terms of the learning path, and the ironic twist was that the job was almost exclusively focused towards black magic, with Raise appearing as the only spell often associated with the white magic school. In terms of application, the Sage only had a limited selection of magic available, something that served as a regression from previous Sages who had a huge array of spells available. Perhaps because of this limitation, the restriction around MP pool was taken away, and even enhanced to the point that Sages had one of the largest MP pools available in the game. They also had their physical frailties removed, and this saw them able to deal a decent amount of damage using maces, the only weapon they could now equip. But Sages weren't without fault. and were given terrible speed to counterbalance their effectiveness at dealing damage, as well as poor resistances. In Tactics A2, Sage was again an exclusive job associated to the Numu race. It still had a connection with the Beastmaster job, but the connection with White Mage was softened, and there were plenty of tweaks made elsewhere. The skill set was still focused towards black magic, with the Sunagar now appearing as the lone piece of white magic. They were also still locked into using maces, but Sages were now much less resilient, with their strength and defense weakened, and their MP pool was also given a serious nerf. Even though Teller was no longer playable in Final Fantasy IV The After Years, the notion of the Sage was kept alive through Leonora. Already a skilled white mage, Leonora was taught black magic by Palom and ended up being quite versatile in both schools of magic. But due to her unofficial training, although Leonora exhibited some traits associated with sages, she was heavily skewed towards white magic and did not have equal proficiency. This was noted with her spell selection, which contained all available white magic but not the most powerful black magic, and her spirit attribute was much higher than her intelligence. But when compared to other mages, Leonora also had a diminished MP pool, had low strength, low stamina and low speed, as well as being restricted to only using rods, staves and bows. To pay tribute to the ultimate jobs that appeared in the original incarnation of Final Fantasy III, when DISSIDIA Final Fantasy launched on the PlayStation Portable, the Onion Knight was able to transform into a ninja and a sage. This job change was possible when entering into the Onion Knight's EX mode, and if the Sage was selected, Onion Knight could perform Holy, followed by Meteor. This application then followed through into Duodecim and Dissidia NT. When work commenced on Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, the developers were keen to bring back traits from the many Final Fantasy games released throughout the late 80s and early 90s, and amongst other things, this meant a strong focus on jobs and a successful return for the Sage. After being obtained from the Holy Tree Tower, the Sage Crown would be useful for those who enjoyed using magic due to their sheer power. But even though some traits were carried over, this iteration of the Sage was much more progressive. As the Sage job had been absent from every major game since Final Fantasy V, there had been limited scope for development. But with this iteration, the designers took the opportunity to explore how the Sage could benefit players within the new framework they had created. In the initial sense, the Sage would have their intelligence and spirit enhanced in equal measure, and they had limited strength. But instead of granting the player access to a wider range of spells, as magic was readily available, the Sage Crown instead granted boosts, and this saw the effectiveness of black and white magic enhanced when performed by a Sage. Sages also had their physical arsenal increased, as alongside staves and bows, they could also use swords, axes, spears, books and harps. And on top of this, they were also granted unique abilities. Speller Gain would allow the Sage to cast numerous spells in a single turn until their AP had been expelled. Diligence would see the cost of black magic decreased, and Betterment would see the cost of white magic decreased. And then there was the ultimate ability, Good and Evil, that allowed a Sage to deal damage to all foes, while also healing all allies. With each character also adorning a grey wig when using the Sage Crown, something that we assume was meant to denote how wise and venerable they became, it meant this particular appearance was the most comprehensive version of the Sage we'd ever seen. But when Teller returned in Record Keeper, almost none of these newfound traits were present, and in many ways the very hallmarks of the job were thrown out of the window. Still classified as a Sage though, Teller could use rods and staves, and could also use white and black magic. There was now a much more defined shift towards pushing Teller as an offensive spellcaster. In the basic sense, even though Teller would have access to rank 5 black magic, the same level of access to white magic would only be granted through a sphere as opposed to being innate. The Teller Legend Sphere also granted significant boosts to black magic damage, with no similar boost granted to white magic proficiency, and his Soul Break and Burst mode abilities were all focused around dealing damage as opposed to protecting allies. In an interesting twist, Teller was also aligned with the Earth element, with almost all of his moves related to Earth abilities. It meant the reappearance of Teller ended up being quite radical, and it wouldn't be until Final Fantasy Explorers that we get to see another more faithful implementation of the Sage job. Granted after completing the 4-star quest Sage and Dragoon Aptitude exam, those who chose to use the Sage job would gain access to a magical powerhouse. And that was because the Sage job had not only the highest magic attack power and spirit in the game, they were also granted access to all high-level ultimate magic. It made them proficient at nuking enemies and healing allies, and their concentrate ability could be used to further raise magical potency and area of effect for a short duration. The only downside was that it would be easy for sages to burn through their AP very quickly. They did have access to Enlightenment, which, much like Diligence and Betterment from 4 Heroes of Light, would reduce the cost of their abilities. But much like sages of the past, players would need to be wise about how they would use the powerful spells at their disposal, as once the AP was diminished, they would be relegated to using a very weak physical fighter who could only master staves and rods, and had very poor strength, accuracy, defense, and evasion. The Sage then appeared not too long after in Final Fantasy Legends Crystal of Space and Time, also known as Final Fantasy Dimensions 2. In the initial Japanese release, the Sage was made into a non-elemental Eidolon that could be obtained as a signet for Journey, and when summoned it would increase the attack and magical attributes of all party members for 5 turns. Journey could also learn the Tetra Magic ability, which would attack a single enemy with magic spells associated with the 4 main elements. The Onion Sage also existed in an earlier version of the game as a tribute to Final Fantasy III. This was a light elemental summon that could perform a move called Infinity. This would deal light elemental damage and also had the chance to inflict instant death while restoring HP to the party and granting haste. MOBIUS featured a huge array of jobs, and Sage was added to the roster in the March 2018 update. Defined as the pinnacle of Mage Jobs by its in-game description, anyone who used the Sage in multiplayer would gain access to high-level actions associated with both the attacker and supporter roles. Its ultimate ability, Revelation, would rain down significant destruction upon foes, and in the multiplayer component would also imbue Lucid Cast, which enhanced mage stats, and Faith, which increased magic. The Sage could then be upgraded to the Arch Wizard and then the Master Sage, providing slightly different utility in battle. There was also a limited time legendary job called the Mythic Sage. This could only be obtained for a 4-week period starting from the 15th of December 2016, and it was much more geared towards offensive play than anything else. The Sage next appeared in Brave Exvius, and what we saw was nothing short of revolutionary. Up until this point, the Sage had often appeared as either a mage job that was the proverbial cherry on the top, or as a narrative device that had a relationship with the plot, but a loose one at that. But in Brave Exvius, sages were thrust into the spotlight as one of the most venerable organisations was known as Hess's 8 Sages. Acting as a low-key ode to the 12 sages that appeared in the original Final Fantasy, Hess's 8 Sages would appear across Season 1 and 2, fulfilling various roles, from being a major antagonist like Sol, or even joining the party and taking on supporting roles. In Season 2, Croa also acted like a sage from a narrative perspective. But from a gameplay perspective, Sakura, one of the main story units, had an association with the Sage job. She could use both black and white magic, albeit with limited supply, and much like Teller and Record Keeper, she was granted an elemental affinity, this time Thunder. Sakura also had an advanced form called Blossom Sage Sakura that amplified her affinity with Thunder and also gave her more application as a healer, especially from Femoral Blossom Hex. And then there's Fina. In Season 1, she excelled with white magic, and after fusing with Dark Fina, one of Hess's 8 Sages, she was granted Mastery of Black Magic. And going all the way back to Final Fantasy III, where Sage could use the other schools of magic too, Fina could even use green magic, and has also added blue magic to her arsenal. At this point, it makes Fina a prime candidate for being the ultimate Sage. But that brings us on to the upcoming appearance of Sage in Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker, which is set to be the biggest and most comprehensive showing of the job to date. Unlike some of the more recent iterations, which have pushed the Sage towards being more aligned to black magic and offensive spellcasting, the Final Fantasy XIV Sage will be designated as a healer, using barriers to shield against damage. Having said that, like the other healer classes in 14, Sage will still have damage dealing applications, and we already know quite a few of the moves that will appear. But what's interesting is that this iteration of the Sage looks very original, with only limited references to the past, perhaps due to Sage not featuring in Final Fantasy XI as a playable job. Moves of note are currently Cardia, which grants the recipient a Cardian status, which allows a portion of damage dealt with certain spells to be converted back to restored HP, Diagnosis, Prognosis, and Physis, which are all variants of Cure, with modifiers possible to also apply barriers, and Dosis, Dysgracia, and Phlegma, which deal varying degrees of damage. Sage also gets a unique style of barrier in the forms of Heimer and Panheimer. When applied, the caster or target party member gets 5 stacks or charges of smaller barriers. If some of them remain after 30 seconds, The protected player will be healed according to how many stacks they have left. These are then complemented by the Sage's Job gauge, which shows stacks of Adder's Gall and Adder's Sting. While Sages can replenish Adder's Gall stacks by themselves, they also gain them over time, and when used, they grant access to upgraded healing and damage mitigation spells. In addition, when one of the Sage's barriers gets absorbed, Sages gain a stack of Adder's Sting, which grants access to an AoE damage spell called Toxicon. In short, the Sage's barriers and healing spells are complemented by their damage dealing toolkit, but with this addition, the developers decided not to lean on any kind of association with the quintessential black and white mages or directly borrowing from any other classes already present in the game. It means when Endwalker releases, the Sage will be rather original in the grand scheme of things, and it will be interesting to see if this influences how Sages get used for years to come. But with that brief look at Sage in Final Fantasy XIV, we hope you've enjoyed this retrospective look at how the job has appeared and subsequently evolved throughout the Final Fantasy franchise. Now, we're keen to understand how many of you are going to be checking out Sage when Endwalker releases, as well as what your favourite iteration of Sage has been up until now, so be sure to let us know in the comments below. If you're interested, make sure to also check out our Kickstarter campaign for our upcoming book, The Legacy of the Crystal, which will document every single major game ever released in association with the Final Fantasy franchise. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, there's a link in the description below. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Anthony Hoffman and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.